Why would anyone point the James Webb Space Telescope at Pluto? Think about it. This is the machine built to see the first galaxies, to look billions of years into the past. And yet astronomers aimed it at a small, icy world on the edge of our own solar system. At first glance, it sounds unnecessary, maybe even like a waste. But that's the wrong way to look at it. Because what Webb saw wasn't boring. It wasn't just another frozen rock. Instead, it revealed something very strange. Pluto went from being the demoted planet to a case study in how complex small worlds can be. And the best part, everything Webb uncovered about Pluto doesn't stay there. It feeds directly into how we understand distant moons, icy exoplanets, and even the story of our own Earth, long ago. Before we dive into what the James Webb Space Telescope actually saw, it helps to pause and remember where our knowledge of Pluto really stood before Webb came into the picture. For decades, Pluto was more of an idea than a real place. Discovered back in 1930, it was just a faint moving dot of light through a telescope, too far away and too small for us to see any detail. It held this reputation as the lonely ninth planet, drifting in the cold outskirts of the solar system. And for most of the 20th century, that was it. Just a mysterious icy speck on charts and in textbooks. The big turning point came in 2015, when NASA's New Horizons spacecraft flew past Pluto. For the first time in human history, we saw it up close. The pictures that came back completely shocked everyone. What had always been described as a frozen dead rock was anything but dead. Pluto had vast plains of nitrogen ice, some as smooth as if they were recently resurfaced. There were jagged mountains made not of stone but of solid water ice, towering up to 11,000 feet, taller than many of Earth's Rockies peaks. There were hints of glaciers slowly flowing across the landscape. And dominating one side of Pluto was a giant heart-shaped region called Tombor Regio, with its left lobe known as Sputnik Planitia. An enormous nitrogen ice basin that seemed to be geologically active with ongoing convection driving resurfacing at rates comparable to Earth's tectonic plates. That one flyby shattered the idea that Pluto was boring. It showed a world full of geological variety. But because New Horizons was moving so fast, it only got a brief look. It passed by once and then sped on deeper into the Kuiper Belt, leaving us with incredible snapshots, but also a mountain of new questions. The atmosphere was one of the biggest surprises. From Earth-based observations, we already knew Pluto had a thin atmosphere, mostly nitrogen with a bit of methane and carbon monoxide mixed in. But New Horizons revealed something even stranger. Pluto's sky wasn't just thin gas. It had layers upon layers of blue haze, stretching high above the surface. Sunlight was breaking down methane, triggering complex chemistry and forming small hydrocarbon particles. These particles built up into haze layers that made Pluto's sky look almost like Earth's, in those dramatic backlit photos. That was something no one expected from such a small and cold world. Scientists were left with puzzle pieces. The haze was there, but how did it form so high up? Why did it seem to create dozens of distinct layers? And even stranger, Pluto's upper atmosphere appeared colder than models predicted. It didn't behave the way a nitrogen-rich atmosphere should. Something was cooling it down, but New Horizons didn't have the instruments to figure out exactly what was happening. Another puzzle was Pluto's relationship with its moon, Charon. Charon is huge compared to Pluto, so large that the two bodies actually orbit a point in space between them, almost like a double planet system. New Horizons gave us our first close look at Charon too, revealing a world covered in water ice, with canyons stretching across its surface and a reddish polar cap that suggested some kind of material exchange between Pluto and Charon. But again, we only got hints. The details of what that reddish stuff was, and how material might be escaping from Pluto to coat Charon's surface, were left unanswered. So by the time Webb launched, here's where things stood. Pluto was no longer a blurry dot. It was a complex little world with active geology, a surprisingly layered haze-filled atmosphere, and a strange partnership with Charon. But our knowledge was still like a snapshot from a single moment in time. We didn't know how stable the atmosphere was. We didn't know the fine details of the haze particles. We didn't fully understand the chemistry on Charon's surface or how far the Pluto-Charon connection went. And because New Horizons was already gone, we didn't have a way to revisit it up close. That's where Webb came in. Unlike New Horizons, Webb doesn't give us dramatic flyby images. It's not going to send back another Pluto heart picture. What makes Webb different is its ability to split Pluto's light into fine detail. In the infrared, it can spot the fingerprints of ices, gases, and even the tiny haze particles in the atmosphere. It can keep watching Pluto over time, track how the atmosphere changes, and pick up signals that Earth-based telescopes miss because our own air gets in the way. So, when Webb turned its golden mirrors toward Pluto, the goal wasn't to redo what New Horizons had already shown us. It was to take all those open questions about the haze, about the surface chemistry, about Charon's polar stains, about the way energy moves in Pluto's atmosphere, and finally start answering them. Why Webb matters for Pluto. The main thing that separates Webb from other observatories is the part of the spectrum it's built to see. Telescopes like Hubble have given us incredible pictures of planets, nebulae, and galaxies in visible light and a bit of ultraviolet light. Ground-based telescopes with adaptive optics can capture sharper details than ever before. But Webb operates almost entirely in the infrared, heat radiation, the kind of light our eyes can't see. That's crucial because in the infrared, you're not just looking at the surface of a world, you're decoding what it's made of. Molecules and ices absorb and emit infrared light in very specific patterns, almost like fingerprints. If you can capture those fingerprints, you can tell exactly what's present, even in tiny amounts. That's what makes Webb such a game changer for Pluto. We already had images of Pluto's surface from New Horizons, but those images didn't tell us what all those different bright and dark patches were made of in detail. New Horizons had some instruments to measure composition, but only within certain wavelength ranges. Earth-based telescopes can fill in some gaps, but looking at Pluto through Earth's atmosphere is like trying to study a painting while staring through a fogged-up window. Webb doesn't have that problem. Out in space, cooled to a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, its mirrors and instruments are designed to be exquisitely sensitive to faint infrared signals. Webb carries several tools that are particularly useful here. There's NIRSPEC, which breaks incoming light into thousands of channels in the near-infrared, perfect for detecting ices like methane and ethylene. There's MIRI, which goes deeper into the mid-infrared, where signatures of more complex molecules appear. Between those instruments, Webb can separate the faint glow of Pluto's surface, the cold, thin air above it, and the haze particles floating dozens of kilometers up. In other words, it can do what New Horizons couldn't. Not just take a picture, but dissect the light into its ingredients and give us the recipe for Pluto's atmosphere and surface. Another reason Webb matters for Pluto is time. New Horizons gave us one dramatic flyby, a single snapshot in July of 2015. After that, it was gone. Webb, on the other hand, can come back to Pluto again and again. It's not bound by a one-time pass. Scientists can track how Pluto's atmosphere changes with the seasons, how the haze builds up or fades, and where the surface features shift with time. This is huge because Pluto's orbit is extremely long, 248 years to go once around the Sun. That means its atmosphere and climate respond very slowly compared to Earth. With Webb, we can start building a time-lapse record, not just a single photo. It's also worth noting that Pluto isn't just a curiosity. It's a member of the Kuiper Belt, a whole population of icy bodies beyond Neptune. Studying Pluto with Webb is like having a reference point. If we understand the chemistry and atmosphere of Pluto in detail, we can compare it with other Kuiper Belt objects Webb might observe. It sets the baseline for what active icy worlds look like. And since these bodies are leftovers from the solar system's formation, every bit of information Webb gathers from Pluto helps us reconstruct the early history of our own system. That's why Webb matters for Pluto. It turns a distant, hazy snapshot into a living, measurable world. It takes the mystery we were left with after the flyby and starts pulling it apart with precision. And as we'll see, the answers it gave weren't just interesting, they were completely unexpected. When Webb finally turned its instruments toward Pluto, the atmosphere was one of the first things scientists wanted to investigate. So, what did Webb actually see? Using its infrared instruments, Webb picked apart the faint light passing through Pluto's air. And here's where things get fascinating. Instead of behaving like a thin but ordinary atmosphere, Pluto's upper layers turned out to be dominated by haze particles. Pluto's haze is made of tiny particles formed when sunlight hits methane and nitrogen. That ultraviolet light breaks the molecules apart. They recombine into heavier hydrocarbons, and those new molecules clump together into fine particles. Over time, they fall, creating a suspended smog that hangs above the surface. Now, scientists already knew those haze layers existed thanks to New Horizons photos. What Webb showed, though, is that these particles are not just passive bystanders, they're running the climate. During the day, the particles absorb sunlight, warming slightly. Then, as the planet rotates and darkness falls, they re-radiate that energy in infrared wavelengths. The effect is that Pluto's upper atmosphere loses heat far more efficiently than if it were just nitrogen. Webb's data confirmed this effect, and the numbers were striking. Pluto's upper air was measured to be around 30 degrees Celsius colder than earlier models predicted. That's not a minor adjustment. That's an entire climate mechanism revealed. To make sense of it, think of Pluto's haze as a giant thermostat. It's not just that the air is thin or cold because Pluto is far from the sun. The haze actively manages how heat moves in and out of the atmosphere. Without those particles, Pluto's atmosphere would likely be warmer and more predictable. With them, the whole system takes on a life of its own. And this discovery matters far beyond Pluto, because it's the first time we've seen haze act as the main driver of a climate in our solar system. That's a brand new category of atmosphere. The spectra Webb collected told us even more. By breaking the light into fine detail, Webb picked out signatures of gases that had never been firmly detected on Pluto before. Ethane, acetylene, diacetylene, and other hydrocarbons showed up in the mid-infrared range. These are products of the same photochemical reactions that create the haze. In simple terms, we now had proof of the chemistry that had only been theorized. And Webb didn't just detect them vaguely. It measured them in different wavelength bands, showing how they're distributed with altitude. Some gases appear concentrated closer to the surface, others higher up, suggesting a layered structure in the atmosphere that goes far beyond just thin and cold. Another intriguing piece was the detection of isotopes, subtle variations of methane molecules like CH3D. Spotting those is tough, but it helps scientists trace the history of the gases and how they've escaped into space over time. Every little variation tells a story about where Pluto's atmosphere came from and how it's changing. The haze itself has an interesting side effect. It influences how much gas Pluto actually holds onto. A body as small as Pluto should lose its atmosphere fairly quickly into space. Yet the haze, by cooling the upper layers, slows the rate at which gases escape. In other words, the same particles that make Pluto's sky glow blue also help the atmosphere survive longer. Webb's measurements supported this idea, showing that the escape of methane into space is less than what some earlier models assumed. And that brings us to one of the quirks. Not all of the methane that escapes actually disappears into space. Some of it drifts outward and eventually lands on Charon, Pluto's biggest moon. Webb helped connect that escape to the reddish stain at Charon's poles, which is thought to form when the methane freezes out and then gets altered by radiation. This is a story we'll expand on when we focus on Charon itself. But the important point here is that Pluto's atmosphere isn't just local. It interacts with its surroundings in ways no one expected. Looking at all of this together, Webb essentially redefined Pluto's atmosphere. Instead of a cold, static shell of nitrogen with some methane mixed in, it's now understood as a dynamic system where haze particles control the balance of energy, complex hydrocarbons trace the chemistry of sunlight breaking apart simple molecules, and escape processes tie Pluto directly to its moon. It's a reminder that thin doesn't mean simple. Even an atmosphere just a fraction of Earth's thickness can have surprising depth. For scientists, this is also a model they can apply elsewhere. Titan, Saturn's moon, has its own thick haze-driven system. Exoplanets might too. Pluto is now the laboratory where these processes are most visible, and Webb gave us the instruments to see it clearly for the first time. What's most remarkable is how this changes the narrative. Before Webb, Pluto's atmosphere was seen as fragile, maybe even on the verge of collapse as the planet moved farther from the Sun. After Webb, we see it as a complex, resilient system shaped by chemistry as much as by sunlight and distance. That shift is huge. It's not just numbers on a chart, it's a whole new way of understanding what keeps Pluto alive as a world. After untangling the atmosphere, scientists turned Webb's instruments toward Pluto's surface, and this is where things became just as fascinating. The first thing Webb revealed is that Pluto's surface is covered in a cocktail of exotic ices, and not just the obvious ones. Everyone already knew nitrogen and methane were dominant players, but Webb confirmed and sharpened the details. Methane ice is spread across large parts of the surface, reflecting sunlight in a way that makes Pluto brighter than it would otherwise be. But methane isn't uniform. It interacts with other molecules, and Webb was able to tease out faint signals of ethylene and other hydrocarbons, showing that the chemistry doesn't stop in the atmosphere. It continues on the ground, where particles settle out of the sky and mix with the frozen landscape. Even more surprising was the detection of isotopic variations, tiny differences in methane molecules that hint at how long they've been sitting on the surface and how they've been altered by radiation. That's not the kind of thing you can guess from a photograph. It takes an infrared spectrograph like Webb's to pick up those subtle differences, and each one adds a piece to the puzzle of how Pluto's surface evolves over time. One of the more subtle but important results is the way Webb separated the heat glow from the surface versus the sunlight reflected off it. Pluto is cold, so cold that the nitrogen and carbon monoxide on its surface stay frozen solid. But everything above absolute zero still emits a tiny bit of infrared light. Webb's instruments could detect that faint thermal emission and distinguish it from reflected sunlight. That separation matters because it lets scientists estimate surface temperatures across different terrains. Sputnik Planitia, for example, isn't just a flat basin. It's an active sheet of nitrogen ice that probably convects, meaning it slowly churns like soft putty over geologic timescales. Measuring the thermal properties helps confirm whether those ices are mobile today or frozen stiff. Webb also picked up carbon monoxide and methane in surface deposits, each with its own distribution. Carbon monoxide tends to gather in Sputnik Planitia, and Webb's data showed how those ices absorb infrared light differently than the surrounding terrain. It's not just a frozen puddle, it's a region with ongoing exchange between the surface and the atmosphere. Gases evaporate in sunlight, condense at night, and possibly even move across the planet seasonally. That kind of detail doesn't come from a quick flyby image. It comes from sustained, high-resolution spectra like Webb delivered. Another subtle finding is the variation in reflectivity. Some areas of Pluto's surface are bright because they're coated in fresh nitrogen and methane frost. Others are darker, stained by complex organics that have been processed by ultraviolet light and cosmic rays. Webb's sensitivity to those darker compounds filled in gaps that New Horizons couldn't, because visible light cameras struggle to separate dark materials. In infrared, the fingerprints stand out, and Webb revealed more about the chemical complexity of those stains. These darker patches are not just dirty ice. They're made of tholins, long chains of hydrocarbons that likely fell from the atmosphere and then baked into the ground. This paints Pluto as a planet where the surface and the sky are in constant dialogue. The haze particles form up high, drift down, and coat the ground. Meanwhile, ice at the surface evaporates in sunlight, replenishing the thin atmosphere. Webb's observations tied those processes together, showing that Pluto isn't just a frozen relic. It's a living system, albeit one that moves slowly in the deep cold of the outer solar system. All of this matters because it changes how we think about Pluto's geology. On Earth, geology is driven by heat inside the planet, pushing up mountains, fueling volcanoes, recycling crust. Pluto doesn't have that kind of energy. Instead, its geology is driven by chemistry, by sunlight breaking molecules apart, by frost evaporating and condensing, by organics raining down from the sky. Webb proved that this process isn't just cosmetic. It reshapes the surface in measurable chemical ways. And here's the bigger implication. Pluto isn't unique in this sense. Many Kuiper Belt objects are likely coated in the same ices, bombarded by the same sunlight, and covered with the same haze fallout. By studying Pluto with Webb, scientists get a template for how these far-off bodies work. Pluto may be the one we can study best, but it's standing in for a whole population of worlds that are still out there, waiting for their turn under Webb's gaze. When New Horizons passed by in 2015, it revealed a world scarred with enormous canyons, icy plains, and a mysterious reddish patch at its north pole. That reddish stain raised a big question. Was it something that came from inside Charon, or was it material falling onto it from Pluto? At the time, we didn't have a clear answer. Webb's observations finally gave us new clues. By using its infrared instruments to break down the light reflected from Charon's surface, Webb was able to detect chemicals that had never been confirmed there before. Carbon dioxide ice was one of the standout discoveries. On its own, it might not sound remarkable, but it's important because it tells us that volatile ices are present on Charon's surface, and that some of them may have been exposed by impacts or delivered from Pluto's escaping atmosphere. Another key finding was hydrogen peroxide, which forms when radiation from the sun, or cosmic rays, interact with water ice. Its presence means Charon's surface is not static. It's being chemically altered over time as radiation reshapes the frozen material. That fits perfectly with the idea that the moon's surface is being slowly processed in space, layer by layer, year after year. These results also help explain the mystery of that reddish polar stain. Here's how the process works. Methane leaks out of Pluto's atmosphere, drifting far enough to reach Charon. At the cold poles, the methane freezes out onto the surface. Once it's there, radiation breaks it apart and transforms it into heavier organic compounds, which slowly build up into a reddish layer. That stain is, in effect, a fingerprint of Pluto and Charon's interaction. It's evidence that the two bodies aren't just connected by gravity, they're physically exchanging material. What makes Charon even more interesting is how different it is from Pluto in terms of overall composition. Pluto's surface is dominated by nitrogen and methane ices, while Charon's is mostly water ice. That contrast shows how two worlds, locked together for billions of years, can evolve in very different ways. And yet the link between them, through escaping gases and surface chemistry, means their stories can't be told separately. Webb also confirmed what scientists suspected. Charon has no detectable atmosphere. It's an airless world, so every process shaping it happens directly on the surface. Radiation, impacts, chemical reactions, all of it plays out in the open, without the buffer of a protective atmosphere. There's no weather to erase impact scars, no winds to shift ice, and no atmosphere to shield it from the harsh solar wind or cosmic rays. That makes Charon a kind of natural laboratory for studying how icy bodies in the outer solar system change under constant exposure to space. The bigger picture is that what we see on Charon probably isn't unique. Many Kuiper Belt objects are thought to undergo the same slow processes. Gases freezing out, radiation turning them into organics, surfaces darkening and reddening with time. Charon just happens to be close enough and large enough for us to study in detail. Webb's detection of specific chemicals that gives scientists a reference point for what might be happening on dozens of other distant icy bodies that we can't observe as easily. Everything Webb saw, Pluto's haze, its frozen surface chemistry, the red-stained pole of Charon, the quiet chemical reactions playing out in deep space. None of it ends with Pluto. It's easy to treat this little corner of the solar system as some isolated curiosity, but it's not. What makes this so important is how much of it connects to everything else we're trying to understand about icy worlds, early Earth-like atmospheres, and even planets we'll never be able to visit. Start with Pluto's haze. It's not just something that makes the planet look pretty in backlit photos. It's a full-on climate mechanism. Particles forming high in the sky, cooling the atmosphere, and falling down to coat the surface. That's not just happening on Pluto. We've seen similar hazes on Titan, Saturn's largest moon. And we've spotted signs of hazy atmospheres on exoplanets, even though we're just catching faint signals from across light years. Understanding how haze behaves, how it forms, what it does to temperature, how it affects surface chemistry, helps us make sense of other planets that are far colder or hotter or more massive. Pluto gives us a place where we can actually study that in detail. The same goes for surface chemistry. On Pluto, we're seeing ices that interact with sunlight and cosmic radiation, breaking down and forming new compounds. That's a cycle: ice, gas, haze, organics, and back again. And it's a kind of cycle that likely played out on early Earth, before oxygen ever took over the atmosphere. Back then, our planet was full of methane and nitrogen too. Sunlight would have driven similar reactions, leading to haze and eventually to organic building blocks. In a way, Pluto is like a frozen echo of Earth's distant past. A world that never got warm enough to turn those compounds into life, but still shows the same chemistry playing out. Charon adds another layer. The idea that one body can influence the surface of another across space, that Pluto's escaping methane can drift over and land on Charon, then get baked into new compounds. That kind of exchange is rare in our solar system. But now that we've seen it, we can start looking for it elsewhere. Could similar exchanges be happening between moons and planets in other star systems? Probably. But without an example here, we wouldn't even know to ask the question. There's also the Kuiper belt itself. Pluto isn't alone out there. It's part of a massive collection of icy objects orbiting beyond Neptune. Most of them are too small or too far to study in detail. But with Pluto and Charon, we get a kind of Rosetta Stone, a reference for what these other bodies might be like. If we understand how Pluto's surface and atmosphere work and what radiation does to Charon's ice, we can apply that to the rest of the belt. This has already started happening. Webb has observed other Kuiper belt objects, smaller ones like Sedna, Quaoar, and Makemake, and it's using the same tools it used on Pluto: infrared spectroscopy, temperature measurements, surface composition analysis. But all of that work makes more sense because we have Pluto as a baseline. It's the only large Kuiper belt object we've visited up close, and now it's also the one we've studied in infrared detail. Even exoplanets come into play here. Most of what we detect about distant planets comes from light, just tiny dips in starlight or faint spectra during a transit. When we see signs of methane or haze or carbon compounds, we can't go there to confirm anything. But we can look at Pluto and say, okay, this is what methane plus nitrogen plus sunlight looks like. This is what haze does to a planet's temperature. This is how surface ice and atmosphere interact. Pluto becomes the test case that helps us interpret data from worlds that are completely unreachable. This is also a reminder that small worlds aren't simple. Pluto used to be written off as just a cold, frozen rock orbiting out in the dark. But now we know it's got an active atmosphere, surface cycles, a history of chemical change, and even interactions with its moon. It's complex, and that complexity tells us not to underestimate the quiet corners of the solar system. So, the reason all this matters goes far beyond Pluto itself. Webb didn't just update our map of a distant dwarf planet. It gave us tools, examples, and comparisons that ripple across the whole field of planetary science. From icy moons around gas giants to faint exoplanets circling red dwarfs, the fingerprints we found at Pluto help decode what's happening on other worlds too. And maybe that's the biggest shift. Before Webb, Pluto was already interesting. But now it's something more, proof that even at the edge of the sun's reach, in the frozen dark where nothing should be happening, nature still finds a way to stay active, to change, and to connect one world to another.